Our next speaker is an expert in the field of light pollution and environmental research. Is Professor Kevin Gaston, who's come to us from Exeter, and we appreciate him traveling all this way to provide his expertise on the topic. So I'll hand straight over to Kevin.
Thank you very much, Brian. That's great. Thank you very much. You hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep. Great. And thank you for the invitation to be here, the opportunity to talk to you today. I talk to lots of journalists about light pollution, and they're always looking for a really good species-specific story. The number of times I've been asked, does light pollution impact lions? What about penguins? What about polar bears? What I want to persuade you today is that that's not the key story. If you were to go to a really basic biology lesson, you would be told, well, once you've got enough water, the two key determinants of much of life on Earth are temperature and light. Some combination of those shapes almost all biological phenomenon, and the different combinations of those things really shape how life varies across our planet. Ecologists have spent an awful amount of time trying to understand temperature. They've actually spent a lot less time, if you agree, Jane, actually worrying about light and light patterns, although we spent a lot of time trying to understand circadian rhythms. But light plays some really key roles in life on Earth. So many organisms use darkness as a resource, many are nocturnal. Many use light as a resource, and almost all use light as information, telling them where they are in the day, telling them where they are in the season, telling them where they are. The top right image here is a breakdown of mammals. So 70% of mammals, roughly 70% of species of mammals are nocturnal. So that's the majority. We don't actually know what proportion of life actually is using darkness. Maybe a half. This paper at the bottom here has literally just came out whilst I was writing this talk. It's a paper that's just appeared in Nature Communications, demonstrating that there's higher nocturnal activity of insects than diurnal activity. So two key things in terms of darkness. Much of life is operating predominantly in the dark, albeit we don't know exactly what proportion. And almost all life is using light as a source of information of some kind. So it shouldn't be any surprise at all that if we start messing with that light, we start undermining those natural light cycles and light patterns, it's going to have really profound biological effects. What's extraordinary is that bar a few early papers when people were looking at seabirds being attracted to lighthouses, or about what was happening to trees in urban areas. Actually, it's only relatively recently that we've really begun to unpick this story. But you kind of predict a priori that we would expect these effects to be rampant. We'd expect them to be pervasive. What we've seen, and particularly in the last 10 years, there's almost an explosion in literature, in studies, demonstrating that that's actually true. What I've done is just pull out some of the papers that have appeared just in the last 4 weeks. These are just what's happened to appear in the literature in the last 4 weeks. So a paper appeared in Proceedings of the Royal Society demonstrating that artificial light impacts a sea urchin species, and it changes its feeding rates and it changes its reproduction. A paper in Conservation Science and Practice demonstrating that bats are actually responding to motion-triggered LED lights. So this is an approach to trying to reduce lighting, where actually as cyclists go by, they trigger the lighting to come on, and the bats are responding to that. The paper Jane mentioned, nightjars, a paper just come out looking at the impacts of artificial light on the behavior of nightjars. and demonstrating that they're responding and their reproductive rates actually change under artificial lighting. A paper looking at the effects of lighting on photosynthesis and respiration in 2 species of plants, demonstrating again that there are impacts. A paper looking at the impacts of, some academics do really kind of very narrow, very niche things. Here's a paper looking at the impacts of artificial light on the flashing rates of fireflies during their courtship and demonstrating that there are impacts. And finally, another marine paper looking here on the sea anemone, demonstrating that artificial light is impacting its feeding activity. And I could go on and on and on and on. These are just the things that have appeared just literally in the last 30 days. You can pull all that stuff together, and we've done a big meta-analysis pulling together hundreds of studies demonstrating that there are impacts on organisms' physiology, their metabolisms, all sorts of aspects, their stress responses, demonstrating that there's impacts on their behavior, on their life histories, their reproduction, their mortality, on their activity patterns, when they're active, when they're not active, and on their seasonal responses, when they're responding to seasonal stimuli. So the story is not, does this impact lions or penguins? The story is, this impacts life at large, almost wherever we start to introduce light. If you synthesize all the studies that have been done, we know that artificial light is changing the biology in marine systems, freshwater systems, terrestrial systems. Brian's already talked about how light is spreading out into the oceans. There's some work demonstrating that the ships up in the Arctic looking at the movements of plankton up and down have had to change their studies because they've suddenly understood that the lights on the ships in the Arctic in the winter actually are influencing the plankton movement themselves. These impact the expression of genes, they impact individuals, they impact populations, communities, ecosystems. Almost every taxonomic group that we've looked at, from microbes through fungi, through plants, through animals. These impacts are occurring at local sites, and that's kind of how we often tend to find it easiest to think about what happens to organisms, plants or animals, when you put lights on in a particular place. But this is also operating on continental scales. We now know that the migration patterns across whole continents of birds are being shifted by artificial light. They get drawn towards lights and they're changing their migration routes. And these effects are both on different spatial scales, from the small to the very large. And they're also from the instantaneous to the decadal, multi-decadal, centuries and beyond. Organisms are finely tuned to natural light signals, and that's been true throughout almost the entire history of life. Tyrannosaurus rex was responding to changes in daily light signals, changing to seasonal signals. And we're changing, so this is at the very essence of how biology operates, and we're changing those natural light patterns. People have shown that even very, very short pulses of light in otherwise natural light cycles at night can change organisms' physiology, can change their sense of timing and circadian rhythms. I think naturally we tend to think about this being impacts on nocturnal organisms, and clearly that's in some ways the most obvious, but it's not just about nocturnal organisms. The picture on the right here is some very simple experiments that a PhD student of mine did just a few years ago. In each case, what you have on the left is a plant experiencing a natural light cycle. On the right is what happens when you have artificial light at night. And you can see glaring differences in how these plants are growing and flowering and maturing. And the other obvious example around, which was what drew me into this topic in the first place, is how artificial light at night changes when birds are singing. I first started working on this problem, asking the question, why are robins singing in the middle of the night in areas that are brightly lit? And we know that artificial light shifts the whole timing of dawn choruses. This is not just about high light levels. For most of the history of life, organisms responding to very low light levels. Many organisms are very finely tuned to lunar cycles and what's happening and whether that increases your risk of predation or your opportunity to predate. All sorts of things are driven by lunar cycles. So when you take all those studies that we've looked at and actually ask, is there a relationship between the intensity of light and biological responses? Actually, as you'll see here, this line is very flat. There's individual responses that might be attuned to the intensity of light and get worse or be more greatly influenced under increasing levels of light. But across all biological responses, there really isn't a huge thing going on. And some of these are actually the other way around. We've shown some experiments that actually low light levels can sometimes be worse than high light levels because organisms are very attuned to these natural cycles. So we're disrupting these things in actually quite complicated ways. That's not to say, by the way, that reducing light levels is not a really good thing. Reducing artificial light levels is really important. These things change timings. Natural light signals, natural light cycles are actually throughout the evolution of life, have been one of the most reliable ways of determining where you are in the day, where you are in the season, or in the year. And so natural light cycles influence things like bud burst, timing of reproduction, timing of migration, timing of when the leaves fall. And artificial light messes with all of those. And there are demonstrated responses of all those things to the introduction of artificial light. And particularly with many animals, artificial light in the evening, just because the story couldn't get better, could it? When do we most want light? We want it in the evening. When is it most disruptive to many of these timings? Actually in the evening. So timings are very, very sensitive. On the right here, I'm sure you've seen this phenomenon around Dublin, is where trees holding their leaves until way outside the normal time of the season when they're near artificial lights. And people have shown those effects on whole continental scales. Actually, the timing of leaf burst, actually, and not leaf burst, but also, I suspect, also leaf fall, actually is altered by artificial light over very big scales. The color matters. Ryan's already alluded to this. Many of these biological responses are very sensitive to emissions in the blue part of the spectrum. And so the shift to LEDs has exacerbated a lot of these biological impacts. The plot at the top right here is a paper that just came out recently where these guys have drawn together all the evidence on impacts of artificial light on melatonin cycles across all sorts of organisms. And shown that the effect actually is much greater. So on this, the blue is on the left-hand side of the plot, and the minus part of the y-axis is the impact. So you're going from high impact on the left-hand side to lower impact on the right-hand side. So the blue part is what's driving the reductions, the suppression of melatonin cycles. That's not just something that happens with people, that's happening with lots and lots of different kinds of organisms. So as we move towards whiter LEDs, and the picture on the right here is the London equivalent of Brian's Dublin. You can see the introduction of white LEDs into the city centre. That's going to have a much greater impact on organismal melatonin levels. The other impact of spectra particularly is on vision systems, and that's something we know not an enormous amount about. We've been doing some modeling of how hawk moths see under different colored lights at night. And here's a visualization of that. And of course, we can't literally put ourselves in the place of a hawk moth and know how a hawk moth sees, but this is how their vision system operates. And this is what happens. So on the second from the left image there is what they would see under moonlight. That would be their natural vision system, and then we can see what happens under white LEDs and under amber LEDs. And so that's, this is offering a challenge for moths in terms of how they find flowers at night, how they find each other, and how they recognize each other, how they avoid predators, how they match against the backgrounds, so that a lot of them are matching backgrounds at night and then sitting still during the day. I guess, how do you know to match against the right background if actually that's messed up by the color system of artificial light? And these effects cascade. So we have impacts on plants that go up food chains. They impact the things that are eating the plants and the things that are eating the things that are eating the plants. They go down food chains where these effects impact predators, but then impact the things that they're eating that then impact the plants and so forth. And one of the important things to recognize in this is what that means is that organisms that aren't directly themselves impacted by artificial light can still be impacted because it's having effects on their resources and their predators. And so these things ramify both across food chains, but also spatially. So it's not hard to imagine that the effects of artificial lighting in one place can actually spill out into places where they aren't actually experiencing that lighting. So the effects of lighting are, in a sense, that phase, diffusing across landscapes. The image on the left here is actually some big-scale experiments we were running a few years ago, which actually attracted the attention of a Belgian artist who thought they were really interesting artistically and wanted to come and take images of them. He wouldn't care less about the light pollution. He's just concerned about them as an art installation. Light pollution also doesn't act in isolation. Jane hinted at some of this, but actually there are multiple pressures on biological systems. And very often these are additive or synergistic. So they might combine together in terms of their impact on biodiversity, but they also brought together might act more than just the sum of the parts, if you like. Some of the effects of artificial light are just as severe as those of climate change. Some of the shifts that we've been seeing in the timing of events are similar in magnitude to the things which are, society is very, very concerned about in terms of climate change. But you bring the light together and the climate change together, and some of the evidence is already, some of the early experiments are suggesting you get more than the sum of those two impacts that bring the two together, which wouldn't be a surprise. You're messing with the temperatures and you're messing with the light regimes. Together, actually, it's worse than just the sum of those two things. They interact with land use change. As we change the structure of environments, then how light is spilling across landscapes is changing. They interact with other pollutants, particularly other atmospheric pollutants, and they interact with how we exploit natural resources. For no other reason than much of that exploitation uses artificial light. Much of the fisheries around the world is using artificial light to actually attract their targets. Now, you might respond to all this and say, well, surely organisms are really adaptable. They can just evolve out of this problem. There's actually very little evidence that that's occurring. There's a little bit of evidence that in some cases there are evolutionary responses, but I think the dependence of organisms at such a deep level and over such a long evolutionary time on natural light cycles means that they actually find it very hard to evolve responses to this. And hence all the arguments about what's the role of light in driving insect declines and driving declines of other organisms, of essentially driving extinctions in different areas. We're putting light into places at times and in forms that naturally it wouldn't have occurred, and that's having pervasive biological consequences. In context of other environmental pressures, we would think about mitigation hierarchies. That's been very central to discussions around plastic pollution, for example. And I think we could perhaps usefully apply that in the context of light pollution. And I'm not going to talk a lot about ways in which we solve this problem, because we're going to hear a lot more about that later. But I just wanted to raise this. And actually, we can debate. I think there is an interesting debate to have, which hasn't happened yet, about what's the right ranking of these things. I mean, so I've ranked these in terms of desirability increasing as we progress through this list. So we could think about offsetting in the way that we have in other consequences. We'll say, well, light this area and we'll remove lighting from somewhere else. Don't think that discussion has happened very widely, but we could do that. I don't think it's a hugely desirable thing to do, because darkness and dark areas is so increasingly precious. But it's a conversation that may arise. We can think about restoring and rehabilitating areas into which historically we have put lighting. And I think that's a really important conversation to have. Are there areas which actually we could bring back darkness in a meaningful fashion? And one of the challenges there is often around people's sensitivity, particularly legal liabilities, that we're actually not having a lit an area is one thing. Having lit an area and taking lighting out of it is quite another, in terms of what if accidents happen, there are break-ins or whatever, then actually that automatically gets linked to changes in lighting and all sorts of concerns around liabilities. But it's a conversation that we should have. The one that we're mostly having is about how do we minimize lighting? How do we dim the intensity of emissions? How do we reduce the duration of lighting? How do we reduce the numbers of lights? How do we reduce the light trespass? How do we change the spectra? Fundamentally, this issue is not about let's do away with lighting. This is how do we put lighting, how do we ensure that the lighting is where we need it, when we need it, in the forms that we need it, and ideally no more than that. That's the fundamental, that should be our fundamental mantra, really. And finally, how do we avoid introducing lighting into places in which it's largely absent? And this is becoming more and more vital on lots of scales. There's maybe small dark areas, there may be very large dark areas in some bits of the world, although not in Europe. How do we protect what I wrote a paper recently about protecting the last of the dark? I mean, I wouldn't have ever anticipated writing something like that. But actually, the spreading of lighting across the planet means that that's actually an issue that we now have to talk about. And we have to talk about things like, how do we protect the West Coast here? And how do we avoid lighting areas that so far we've managed to avoid? And just to conclude, one of the things I find fascinating about this whole life, many of the discussions that we end up in around environmental pressures center on the notion that if we start doing things now, it might take decades before we see outcomes. So with climate change, we know that we're locked into a lot of climate change already, almost no matter what we do now. Plastic pollution, it's going to take, if we stopped selling plastic tomorrow, there's going to be a lot of plastic pollution around for decades, hundreds of years. Lighting is a whole different issue. I wouldn't pretend that if we take the lighting away, all the impacts that happen to lighting will disappear overnight. But actually, we can switch off quite literally much of this pressure and change it very, very rapidly. And I think we would see very rapid responses. Thank you kindly.